we will get this thing going. So welcome to our last presentation of URISA Texas, the speaker series for the year. My name is Brian King. I have a great presentation for you today. We have John Nelson out of East Lansing, Michigan, but John works with Esri. He is the Zen master of ArcGIS Pro and cartography and mapping, and he also has a master's degree as well from Central Michigan University. He has a PhD coursework at Michigan State University, and he also is embedded with story maps. And so we are really happy today that John's with us. And so John, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and I'll mute, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Brian. Well, thanks for the invitation for sure. And thanks everybody for showing up. It's an honor to talk about maps with anybody, but especially a group this big. So yeah, I'm going to talk about 5 tips for making maps that engage and communicate. Let's see here. Here are the sponsors. So some links and some sponsors. Of course, before we get rolling, record all this into your memory banks. Hi there. So thank you very much. Like Brian said, my name is John Nelson. I work at Esri. I do a lot of user experience design for various apps. Most of the apps happen to be available in the Living Atlas. So the Living Atlas is a big repository of data that we make available to folks, and you can contribute your data to it, and we'll help you disseminate that and house it and things like that. And when I'm not doing those things, I'm making weird maps and exploring cartography and playing with different ideas, and then sharing that process out via, myriad social media channels. So I recognize this is an awful lot of links, especially when I pasted them all in here. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of links. It feels like homework. Don't think of it as homework. Think of it as options, which you can ignore or peruse as you see fit. When I was first kind of thinking about the prospect of speaking to all you Texans, it was very exciting, and I was like, well, gosh, what am I even going to say? And so I put that on Twitter, of course, as I do. And then right away, Ed Harrell wrote back and he said, well, you should start with howdy. I was like, howdy, start with howdy. But Ed is from Alabama. And what does he know about Texas, right? And so naturally, I was a little bit cautious. What's Ed got up his sleeve? Is he, trying to set a trap for me? And he said, no, I'm here in Galveston, and everybody's saying it all over the place here. Galveston, okay. And I was looking at the NAPS-G Foundation conference that he was at. And I was like, oh, this is pretty legitimate. Okay, Ed, thank you for the advice. And then the next order of business was really just, do I like this tweet? And therefore implicitly endorse Ed Harrell and the NAPS-G Foundation? And the answer is yes, I did. So if I'm going to say howdy, I thought I should do it right? How is howdy actually pronounced if you're a real Texan, which I am not. And you would be surprised at how many people are interested in learning how to sound like a Texan. So here's a YouTube video, 250,000 hits, how to sound like a Texan. But no matter how much I tried, I really ended up just sounding like William H. Macy from Fargo. So forget it. I'm just going to stick with the standard Great Lakes area friendly mitten state greeting of hi there. So I'm going to go with that. So as I was complaining earlier on, I'm a little bit jealous of everyone there, because last week I was mowing the lawn, which is the lazy man's way of raking leaves here in Michigan. And the next day, my yard looked like this, right? So that's my office, by the way, completely encased in snow. And I find that ridiculous. And so just the fact that I'm chatting with you folks is kind of a relief for me. I can imagine that I'm in the warmer confines. And lately, I've been finding myself in the business of giving advice, which is weird. Nobody recognizes more than me how absurd it is that I'm giving any sort of advice. But when you get asked to speak at stuff, generally it boils down to like, try this, don't do this, don't do that. And that's pretty absurd, right? And so I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of survivorship bias. Well, it looks like somebody is trying to lasso my graphic there with their draw tools. That's cool. I don't know if you're familiar with survivorship bias, but the best example of it that I've ever heard is this this story of World War II bombers coming back, and these bombers came back and they consistently were riddled with anti-aircraft holes in the same spots. It was clustered along the same spots, and so they actually put together a study to study this and make a recommendation. So learned folks kind of sat down and looked at this, and their recommendation was, I kid you not, we need to put more armor in these places where it's getting shot at a lot. And then one smart dude spoke up and he said, wait a second, what we need to do is literally the exact opposite thing. We need to put armor where there aren't these bullet holes. And the answer for that was because these are the ones coming back. These are the ones that survived. The ones that got shot in the other areas didn't make it back. So that's an example of survivorship bias. Things work for me and things work for you, and they might not be the same thing. The career path that I've taken is kind of weird and meandering. And so honestly, who am I to give advice? But nonetheless, here I am giving advice. I'm giving you 5 tips, like I said in the title, but at least in the description, I couched those tips as being unfounded and ridiculous or something like that. So, but anyways, I tend to be pretty optimistic and forget the failures and the hard stuff in the past. I've been accused by my wife of being a lot like this guy here. So anyways, 5 tips for making maps that engage and communicate. Well, I'll be honest with you, I came up with 4 tips. So immediately, right out of the gate, you are faced with the prospect of a 20% reduction in your expected return on investment in this. And for that, I totally apologize. And so I'm going to really try to make it up to you and do my very best and give you just 4 dynamite out of the park tips. So let's get going. First one is use what works. And the second one is about just enoughification. We'll get into what that means even. And the third one is making maps for fun, unbounded play, and the value of that. And then the fourth one, I'll chat about collaboration a little bit. So let's dive in on misusing what works. Here is a website run by NASA of active fires. And there are satellites that are whizzing around the Earth right now. There's 2 of them, and on board these 2 satellites are sensors that detect thermal anomalies, which are essentially fires, or at least something that it suspects is a fire. And this data is beamed down into this website. And I'm going to be demoing, by the way. So to make it up to you for robbing you of 1 tip, right, 20% of your ROI, I'll be doing all of my demos without a net, totally live demos, no like recorded demos. So this is what you're going to get. So that fire data is beamed down to this NASA website, and they generously make it available to the public, which is totally awesome of them. And it's just amazing, right? What era we live in. How cool is that? So for the whole world, here is the last 7 days of fire. And there's just this little CSV file that loaded here. I'll open this up in trusty old Microsoft Excel. Who doesn't use and know and love Microsoft Excel? Don't answer that last part. Okay, so we've got lat long, brightness, you know, some positioning information, a date, a time, of course, which satellite was the one that recorded the fire, how positive is it that it's even a fire, how bright was it, and FRP is really interesting. That's essentially the, that's fire radiative power. That's the released energy that it's detecting at that 1 kilometer cell on the surface of the Earth. And lastly, you know, is it day or night? Now, I actually use Excel quite a bit just to do an initial exploration of non-geographic data, or maybe kind of look at options for charting and stuff like that, making a chart. It's actually a pretty handy tool for charting. And I was actually making a chart years ago when somebody asked if I knew what a pivot table was. I was like, no, because I was stuck in this realm of columns and rows, just as it was in wrestling with the charting tools to figure out how to get a chart, even though the columns and rows weren't necessarily how I needed them to be. And they said, we should do a pivot table. Pivot table's awesome. I was like, okay, teach me. So here's a pivot table. I'm going to select all these columns and I'll insert a pivot table. And now I'm kind of freed up from that default tyranny of rows and columns as it was. It's got all this data and it says, hey, John, how do you want to slice and dice this data? I'm not going to change anything about the data, but you can look at it in different ways. For example, I can say like, okay, show me satellite A versus satellite T. In columns, I want to see if it was day or night. And then for the cell values, I'll drag in this energy released thing. And instead of just a simple count, I'll say sum up all of that released energy. And that's cool. Now I've got my own table based on, the source table, but we're cartographers, right? And so what we like to do is color code everything and turn them into thematic maps. And one of the big ways of doing that is choropleth mapping. And we do that because numbers are abstractions, and color is a really nice way of showing value in a more kind of intrinsic way. So if I look at this, okay, I guess that one's a little bit bigger, but numbers are abstractions. So let's come into the Home tab here and do what's called conditional formatting and say, boom, okay, wow, that's a lot hotter, less, and then very few fires detected at night from this satellite. That's pretty interesting.
I'm watching. No, you're good.
So I was looking at this and I was like, well, I can do all sorts of slicing and dicing. Let's go back here. And I had latitude and longitude. So let me just make a new row here, or a column called lat. This one I can call long. And this is a rather precise number. So I'm just going to round it to the nearest whole number for the latitude. So I'll say equals round. And then choose the latitude and say 0 precision. And then I'll say equals round longitude. Oops. Longitude with 0 precision. So I've got whole numbers for my latitude and longitude. And I'll flood fill down. And now I've got a new attribute here. So let's do another pivot table. And I'll say, okay, latitude and longitude on a whole number. Well, we're geographers, so we know that latitude really is nothing more than up-downiness, north-southiness. And that's just equivalent to rows, right? So let me grab latitude and drop this into the rows column. And the way we organize latitudes is we have a reverse sort where it gets higher as you go north. And then let's choose longitude for columns. And then we'll drag our fire radiative power and drop it right here. And then we'll make our cells roughly square. We'll zoom out and take a look at what we've got. We've got something pretty interesting. Now, if I could hear what you were saying and I asked, what is this? Hopefully a bunch of people would shout out, it's a map, John. Of course it's a map. Holy cow, you've made a map in Microsoft Excel. This is insane. Pandemonium. Cats are sleeping with dogs. This is nuts. So let me go in here. And like I said, cartographers like to color code stuff. And we'll make the background black. And we'll make this font size pretty small and center it. And instead of just numbers, let's conditionally format these things. So we'll do 3 scales. The bottom 10 percentile of this dark kind of blue. The mid-range, we'll have it look red, fire red. And then the highest 10 percentile will scale all the way up to bright, flaming, white hot yellow. Let's see what that looks like. So now we've made, in Microsoft Excel, a pseudo map of the world aggregating 1 week's worth of wildfire information in Microsoft Excel as pivoted cells. Now, Microsoft Excel has no idea that it's just made a map. All it's doing is happily pivoting cells, aggregating things, and color coding them because I told it to. Now, I only thought to do this because humans are devious creatures and we use tools so that we can get a job done, right? Tools don't tell us what to do. We tell tools what to do. So the fact that I'm making a map in Excel is no big deal. I mean, I've used ArcMap to join two completely non-geographic Excel tables to do a table join because it's actually really hard to do that in Microsoft Excel. So, you know, I can use Excel to make a map. I can use mapping software to join tables that have no geographic properties because they get the job done, right? They're there to help me, and so I happen to use them for whatever works, right? And so my advice to you all in this regard is misuse what works. There's nothing wrong with having a pretty broad and diversified set of tools that you include in your workflow. That's cool. If it works, it works. That's great. And if you're using tools as they're intended, then you should really be thinking about how you can twist it and turn it to do what you really want them to do, right? So first start out with an idea and then see what tools can get you there, and not necessarily the other way around. Okay, tip number 2, just enoughification. That's interesting. What is this guy even talking about? Oh, let's see. A lot of the times our maps can just be loaded with stuff. And there's a big temptation to do that because this map looks kind of important. It looks important to have a really busy map that's kind of hard to read. And maybe there's a little bit of pride that I would feel in making a map that people really have to like stop and study and be like, wow, there's a lot going on here. Nelson must be really busy. This is important, right? And then they feel like they have to dig in and try to understand it. And I'm like, yeah, you have to try to understand it. Imagine how it's like to be me, right? But in reality, people aren't going to do that. They'll just look at a really complex map and then look away and use other sources of information to do the job that they've got to do. So there's enormous power in making maps that are very simple to understand. Now, that doesn't mean that the maps you're making aren't complex. It means that you're parsing them and showing them to other human beings in a manner that they can kind of understand and conceptualize as you go. And there are a few different strategies for that. So I'll show you one strategy, which is to break it up into a narrative. So here's a story map that I made about a really serious pandemic spread by zombies, zombie bites. Here's that dog's dinner of a map, right? But it's not so bad if we break it up and reveal it in a narrative fashion. So here's a blank location or a blank base map of the United States. And here are the initial outbreak locations of this plague. None of them are in Texas, by the way. Thank goodness Oklahoma and Louisiana took the brunt for y'all. So here is the spread of this pandemic after the first week of slowly crawling hamsters. And then the second week, they really picked up some steam apparently. And then after the third week, this is the outbreak zone, the hot zones for these disease-ridden animals. And then I've kind of split this out into a new section, introduced a new concept, a new category of data, and I talked about the response to this. So here are those outbreak zones, but we also happen to have response teams strategically positioned throughout the United States, and here are those locations, and I'm using a narrative to describe what I'm seeing as I'm revealing it progressively. And those containment teams went out in 3 waves. Now here's the initial wave of containment teams went out based on their close proximity to the initial hot zones, which makes sense. And then the second wave of containment teams after the first wave was completely wiped out, went to even broader regions. And then lastly, the third wave of containment teams stymied the spread and prevented a full-scale outbreak. And in this way, you know, we've got a crazy map, that kind of makes sense because I'm telling a story as we go. Now, another strategy for this is color. A lot of the times folks will use a lot of color in a map because it looks cool, or we've got something about water and fire and sewer utilities. And so obviously we're going to use blue for water, and we're going to use a drop icon because that's water. But in reality, the more color that you add to a map, the more complexity it invites for the users to interpret that, the people who have to read it. And it might seem counterintuitive, but there's a lot of effective communication that can happen when you show a lot of restraint for different visualization dimensions, color specifically. So if you want to make a map of water utilities, then make a map of water utilities and then have that be essentially the only thing on the map, only with secondary contextual layers there to support the fact that you're looking at a water utility map. Same goes for all kinds of data. And there's nothing wrong with making lots of different maps that live in a family. So a collection of maps which are intended to be presented as a team, instead of one map that is expected to do all of the heavy lifting. Now I'll show you just kind of a simple example of one map that uses just one color. So this is a fully monochrome map, and it shows the length of the Appalachian Trail. So if I zoom in here, right, here's this Appalachian Trail map cover, and it's only using one color of blue, right? That's it. Now, it's showing you a lot of data. It's got north arrow, it's got overview maps, it's got state parks, it's got a 5-mile scale grid reference overlay, it's got state labels, there's hillshade for crying out loud, there's the trail itself marked with all of these places to sleep over, and it's got state boundaries. Now, everything that you're seeing here is the same hue of blue. It's just using maybe different thicknesses, different opacities, and different stroke techniques. And it's very obvious, that this isn't, a state line, right? Or the state line isn't the park or the Appalachian Trail itself. We're using non-color cues because color is a little bit too easy, but it's also very complex. And if color doesn't mean something in your map readers are going to interpret it as though it does mean something, and they'll wonder what they're missing, or they'll add complexity and wonder what the complexity is that they're not getting, and then they'll have slightly reduced confidence in what they're working with. So default to monochrome, and then only if you need colors, layer in colors, and only add color if the color means something, right? Okay, so that is monochrome mapping. The last example I'll give you isn't necessarily an example, but it's a tool, a handy tool, a resource. So I've just Googled Colorblind Simulator, and you can see what's available here. But up to 10% of the population has some form of color blindness. But honestly, anecdotally speaking, in my experience, it sure seems like there's a lot more than 10%. And maybe that's just in the mapping area. I feel like there's a much bigger proportion of actual cartographers and map makers that I know that are colorblind. I'm almost never surprised now when a map maker who I'm very familiar with their work will say, well, I happen to be colorblind. I'm like, oh, well, yeah, of course. Because there's so many colorblind folks, color deficient people. And this is a tool that I like to use sometimes. It just helps you put on some empathy goggles and say, I'm making a map. Is this map actually going to be readable to 10% of the population who may have to read it as a part of their job, right? And so let me pull in an example here of a map I've made. Here's a red to yellow to green stoplight metaphor map. Now this is actually a very popular color scheme, and managers like to ask for this, and customers will like to ask this. They'll say, well, give it to me in a stoplight color scheme, red, green, yellow. Yellow's, average or in the middle, and it'll be a diverging color scheme that goes either to red or to green. And I'll tell you, this is bad news because the vast majority of color deficient folks out there have red-green sensitivity issues, and they can't necessarily see very well the difference between reds and greens, especially when they're shown in conjunction with each other. So for example, this will simulate what they would actually see, right? Now, if I had to do a job, I'd be in a really tight spot at this point. So this is somebody who's fully red-green colorblind, and this is somebody who would have a weak red-green issue. And so use colorblind simulating tools and just run your map as a sanity check here. And this isn't obviously a perfect simulator who can possibly do that. And everybody's perception of these colors might be a little bit different or varied, but give this a shot. I actually also have a tool that I've added to my browser itself, an extension called the No Coffee Vision Simulator. So if I set this back to normal, you can see this rainbow here. Anytime I'm looking at a map, frequently I'll say, oh gosh, what does this look like for people with, this version of colorblindness? And it's sobering. So remember to check out these tools and be aware of, the rather large proportion of the population who has issues with that sort of color vision. So that was just enoughification. Rolling along to look at all these spots of annotation people have sprinkled on the map. This is great. It's like a little star constellation of people interacting with the presentation. It's cool. Okay, tip number 3, second to last tip. We got 4 people. Tip number 3, make maps for fun. What is this guy talking about? Well, making maps for fun is really important. And while I fire up a project of ArcGIS Pro, which happens to be loading in the other window on my machine, I'll drag it over once it loads. There we go. So oftentimes when I make a map and I share the results, I'll get feedback saying that looks like a lot of fun. I think I could use that for this project or that project, or I just want to try it out because it's interesting. And they'll say, I think I've got some time this weekend to work on it. I think, what? No, this is professional development, unbound exploration of your skill set is professional development. Now you might feel like, well, I'm very busy, and I'm sure you are, and I've been very busy too. But it's the job of your organization and your manager to make sure that you've got enough to do. And it's the nature of work to fill itself with tasks depending on the amount of time that you have. That's the nature of the work universe. That's going to happen. You have to take active steps to carve out some of that for professional development and self-improvement and play. And a lot of that just happens to be with, I made a map and I'm interested about how to use this technique that I saw online, or I made a map for a customer and I really actually in hindsight wish I was allowed to do this, or I have an idea after the project is done, I want to try it out. Go ahead and do it. Make those maps. Reserve time. Just take that time. And I promise you, you'll become a better map maker. You'll become a better GIS analyst. And you'll be faster and more creative at your real work, right? The real stuff. You'll get better at that. Okay, soapbox. Stepping off the soapbox. Let's play with this map. So I've got a solid background color, and I'll get rid of my stroke, and my solid fill, instead of a solid fill, let's choose a picture fill, and I'll browse to a picture location, which happens to be way down here. I'll copy this link so you don't have to see me navigate again. I'll choose watercolor paper. This is a photograph I took of some, actually this was drawing paper, a close-up of drawing paper, but it looks like watercolor paper. So I'll make it 200 point, and there you go. Kind of looks like I'm working with a canvas now. And for this land layer that I've got here, let's also make this a picture fill. We'll navigate to that same folder. And I've got a watercolor texture that I've made that you can't tell it's a watercolor texture until I tint it. So right now, by default, it's white. But one of the cool things about using picture fills and picture strokes is you can tint it by whatever color. And whatever color you choose, that's the color that is painted in any of the pixels' whiteness. So I'm tinting this kind of, I'll show you what it looks like. So now I've got, you know, it looks pretty watercolory. But if you've looked closely at a watercolor picture before, you know that there are these kind of bleedy edges where the paint kind of builds up, and you can kind of see through that to the sketchiness, you know, that the artist had first sketched it out in pencil, and you can see that in watercolor, and I think that's kind of lovely. So let's see if we can replicate that in a formal, crisp, stuffy GIS, right? So here's our line, and we'll add an effect, and this time I'm going to choose a wave effect, and that just makes it squiggly. And let's look at our options for the wave effect. I'll make it random, and I'll really stretch these out. And instead of, well, let's make this 1 pixel. Instead of gray, I'll go black, and then make it semi-transparent, mostly transparent. So it's 80% transparent. Okay, it's interesting. Let's hit apply and see how that looks. We're getting somewhere. But if we go back to this structure and just duplicate this, and we tweak the wave amplitude a little bit, so now we get something that looks sketchy, right? Sketchy maps. Ladies and gentlemen, sketchy maps. That's what I offer you today, is sketchiness in your map making. And now let's see what we can do about that buildup of paint that happens along the edge of watercolor paintings, where the water is wicked into the dry areas and it leaves behind the pigment along the perimeter of painted features. So let's come back here. We'll add a layer. We'll add a stroke layer. And that's just a line. And instead of a solid stroke, let's choose gradient stroke, which rules. Gradient strokes are great. And we'll make this nice and thick, let's say 12. And then the offset, will snug it in half of its width so that it's only rendering inside the polygon. And for the outer color, we'll choose like a nice deep green tarragon. What a cool sounding color. And we'll make this semi-transparent, I don't know, like 40%. And then it'll transition to another kind of green color. And then this one will make 100% transparent. Right? That's pretty interesting. Now let's make this round, and we'll make it accurate so it tries to hug the actual geography. And then we'll hit apply and see what happens. Now we've got something that looks actually pretty seriously watercolor painted. Now, if you wanted to really get crazy, you could duplicate this and make the stroke width thinner, you know, to really kind of hone in on that edginess. And you'll just have a lot of fun, right? So let's look at water bodies. Okay, so right now we've got water bodies, and we've got this green. We did all this work, right? Which wasn't actually a lot of work, to make a watercolor symbol. That's cool. I don't want to start from scratch, right? So let's save this work, and we can just save this to our style, and we'll call it watercolor. Which means when I open the symbology panel for water bodies, I can just go to the gallery and say, boom, you are now watercolor as well. And I didn't have to redo all that work, right? If there's a way to save myself any effort, I'm going to find it. And we can make tweaks to this. So the tint, for example, let's make it blue. And then this color, we can play with this stuff too. So it's easy. Use saturation value. I like to use this color model, because you've got this color gradient you can play with. So let's make it look like that. So there you go. Now we've got some watercolory lakes. And the cool thing is if I actually had painted this and I wanted to pan or zoom or change the projection, I'd have to start over, right? But now I can zoom in and it's happy to re-render it to me at whatever scale I'm at. Do you know why? Because GIS rules. That's why. It's magical. It's straight up magic. All right, so let's see. Boy, should I do the dotted line thing? I'll show you that real quick. So here are country borders. And we can do something very similar with these guys. So here's the wave effect. And I'll do random on the wave and make them quite long. And a dash effect. So I don't generally do much with dash effects unless I'm trying to make something real looking, never actually for a real purpose. And what's a dash template? So it's two numbers separated by a space. The first number is how many pixels on it is, and how many pixels off it is the second number. And I can say something like maybe 12 on, 5 off, 22 on, 6 off, 11 on, 4 off. And that way I get something that goes kind of long, short, long, short, long, short. And then if I do a similar color, oops, I make this black, semi-transparent. It'll look graphite-y, especially when I make a duplicate of it and just kind of tweak its wave settings. So now I've got country boundaries that look like they're kind of these little pencil sketched dash lines. And that was very easy to do. So you just saw me do all this from scratch. And I'm very proud of it. I think it's wonderful. I want to keep it forever. Just kidding, I'll close this and not save it. Okay, so making maps for fun. Here's my symbols that I used. And if you find me on social media, I post these all the time. Actually, I just made a YouTube video that shows you how to do this, and you can find these references and try this for yourself in the YouTube video. And there you go. So number 3, making maps for fun. So like I said, do this sort of stuff at work because, this is a watercolor map, right? Sure, I just showed you how to make a map that looks plausibly watercolor. Why would you want to do that? Well, do you work for a Parks and Rec department? Do you work for a county that has a new park coming? Do you have a site suitability analysis that you're pitching to the public and you want to make it look kind of artistic and sketchy and painted? Architects have this figured out, but map folks, we're getting there, right? But architects make renderings that look like they're hand painted. Cartographers should also have those resources too, right? Land use planners, GIS analysts. We can make maps that look like they're artistically created. And there's a value in that, right? There's an audience for that sort of thing. My last tip, number 4, collaboration. This is my 11-year-old son, Juno. And 2 weeks ago, he came into my office. It's 3 minutes before we have to walk out to the bus. So I work from home. That little wood shed that you saw at the beginning of the presentation is where I work. He comes in and says, "Hey, Dad, it's time to wait for the bus." And then we go throw the football. But this time he came in 3 minutes early and he said, "I've got an idea for a map." And I said, "Oh, that's cool. What is it?" He said, "An age map. I want to see an age map that shows you people's ages." And I was like, "Oh, that is actually a really cool idea." And I looked at the clock and it was 3 minutes before we had to walk out to the yard and wait. And I thought, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes. Okay, we can do this. And so I pulled up this county population data that I had from the US Census. And I immediately put it into a projection that is fair. Now, when you talk to an 11-year-old and you say, this projection isn't fair because it makes these counties look bigger than they are in real life, that's tantamount to heresy, right? That's not fair is the worst thing you can say about a thing. So I said, if we use this, and he's like, oh, it bends. I was like, well, yeah, because actually in real life, it bends. The earth is round. And when we flatten it out, there's different ways that we can flatten it out. And different ways of flattening, you know, are good for different jobs. But this kind of flattening is good for showing areas that are the same, right? So he liked that, right? As long as something is fair, then he's going to be on board. And he looked at it and he said, wow, it's all square. And I was like, oh man, he's right. Counties as an enumeration unit are very convenient because they're there and they have data wrapped up in them all ready to go for you, right? And so in my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, he's right. This is kind of a knee-jerk reaction. But you know what? 3 minutes, you use what you've got, right? So that's cool. I'm using it. I'm aware of the fact that sometimes the geographic nature of political boundaries is arbitrary and complex and can introduce problems like the modifiable aerial unit problem. But guess what? We had 3 minutes. And he said, I want to see how old people are. So I opened this up. I said, okay, we can use color to show you how old it is. And I did this. I chose graduated colors, and immediately it looked like this. Now, I hadn't even taken the time to look at what the default selected value was, but it happened to be 2010 median age. And he looked at it and he said, wait, is that it? Did we do it? And I was like, oh, I was actually a little stunned myself. I was like, yeah, Juno, that's it. We just made an age map of the United States. And right away, he's picking out patterns. He's looking at places that are very young. He's looking at places that are old. I'm looking at the tip of the mitt here, the mitten, as we say in Michigan. You know, wow, that's kind of an elderly population here on average. You know, he's noticing these little tracks of older populations, and he giggled. He's like, look at how red that is, and he chuckled. And I knew why he was chuckling, is because he's picturing a bunch of old people in a place, which is funny, right? 11-year-olds are amazing. But he's looking at this and he's picking out broad geographic patterns. And that's exactly what he should be doing with a map like this, because we've only got 5 categories here and we're using natural breaks, right? So a natural breaks on a very small set of classes is going to show me some kind of stark patterns. And that's exactly what he was doing. I was very proud of him. And I said, yeah, you can split this out in different ways. And he said, well, how old is that place? And so I said, well, everybody there on average is older than 62. Oh, that's interesting. And I said, well, hang on a second. Let's take a closer look. And so I said, we can chop it up into different groups. And so I chose equal interval. And then I just maxed it out. I just picked 32 classes to make it really smooth and give you like a really nice sense of where old and young was in the country. And then Juno starts picking out outliers, just like he's supposed to do with this categorization and this this number of classifications in that scheme. When you've got a really broad swath of colors like this, really it's good then to isolate outliers. And it was great. It was like this real life example of all these theories that you hear in GIS classes. Well, guess what? Juno saw this, and then he's like, why is it so old there? Why is it so old there? And so we start digging in and clicking things, right? We click this. Turns out this is the oldest average county in the United States, in Florida. And then Juno starts asking questions. Well, why is it so old? And I mean, my mind is swimming, right? You can think of a whole lot of things in a second and a half, more than you can verbalize out loud. And I said, well, there's 2 reasons that places are old. Some places, like up north where Grandpa lives, the old people stay and the younger people leave to get jobs. And so it's not old people going there, it's young people leaving. And so the old are the leftover people. And in some places, there's a lot of older people because they want to go there because they retire and they want to be comfortable in a warm place when they retire. Now, his grandpa retired. He knows what retirement means. And so he got it, right? So he's swimming in these notions of migration, the economic ideas of an aging area. And, you know, if it means it's going to be kind of a poorer place or a place where people want to go, a destination, he's like swimming in all these ideas, and he's not blown away and amazed. It's just what he's being led by a map. And I think a lot of the times the maps that we make, a misconception that we have is maps have to answer a question. Maps don't necessarily answer questions. Juno's question was, I want to see a map that shows people's age. That's an open-ended question. Maps guide and reveal better questions, right? They don't necessarily answer questions. They guide you towards a better understanding of something. And it was just pretty matter of fact to Juno. And I even said, well, we can figure out, you know, the top 10 oldest counties in the United States. You know, where is it the absolute oldest? And he thought that was cool. There's the youngest, and here's the oldest. I selected these, and right away they show up on the map. Now, do you think Juno was amazed at the fact that I was interacting with a table linked attribute empowered set of vector geometry data? No, again, that's just how it is. Kids can't be amazed at everything because everything that they're learning is new and wonderful, right? If they actually seemed amazed, they wouldn't be able to function. But that's pretty amazing. And it wasn't just cool for Juno, it was cool for me, right? So I got to see the geographic question process from the eyes of an 11-year-old. I got to see spatial discovery and data interrogation from the perspective of an 11-year-old. And that's incredibly valuable, right? It's so valuable to get that new and fresh perspective, but also it's valuable to coach young folks in what's possible with GIS and mapping. And that's a wonderful opportunity to say, hey, look, this world is magical, and here's the best way that we know how of making a model of that world. And they appreciate it. So lastly, that last tip is go ahead and make maps with kids. If you don't have your own kids to make maps with, find some kids. There's lots of opportunities, and do both, right? And share your work publicly on the wilds of the internet. That's some advice I have for you, reckless and unfounded advice, of course. Most of the people I know in the mapping community, I met virtually on Twitter, and I've never actually met them in real life. I just know them via Twitter and the maps that they share, and my admiration for them grows. And they give me feedback and I give them feedback, and it's a wonderful way to grow in your trade. And another way to grow in your trade is go to conferences and actually meet these people in real life, which frankly is the best part of a conference, is seeing somebody that you only know as an avatar profile picture on Twitter and saying, oh my gosh, that's a real person. And it's this person. And it's so much fun. And you'll learn an awful lot, and you'll talk to them. Go ahead and present. You know, you don't really know something until you have to explain it to someone else, of course. If you're a bit too nervous to do that, which I totally understand, just print a poster that you've made for your community or your work, your project, and bring it in and show it off and tell people what you did and why, and hear about their projects and their plans and what they did, and you'll become a better map maker and a better GIS analyst for sure. So that is it, my friends. Thank you so much for listening to me jabber for 50 minutes straight. I'm sorry. Thank you. Yeah, there's some resources for you to follow up on if you're at all curious.
Well, John, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Fantastic presentation. Addie, I'm not sure if I saw it. I think 202 people was the max, or you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm usually wrong. But at any rate, I think it was a really good one here. So we're getting a lot of people on the chat here. We've got a few minutes. A lot of it is just thank you. Great presentation. If anybody has a question, the biggest question is yes, we did record it, and hopefully there's no issues. It's being pushed to the cloud to eliminate any issues, and we'll have it up to our YouTube channel as soon as we possibly can, hopefully sometime today. So again, don't really have any questions, John. All it is thanks a bunch. Oh yeah, we got a thank you from Germany, John.
Hey, all right.
That might be the furthest one. So You got Germany. We've got Lubbock, Texas.
That's great.
What could be better? So
Germany. I'll be there in.
oh,
I'll be there in March, my German friend.
Here's
The Esri User Conference.
Here's one from the Netherlands. That's pretty cool.
Right. I love the Netherlands.
I tell you what, we do things in Texas, John. We tend to go big.
It's big.
The colorblind tool. Yeah, that someone just mentioned that. What's the website? Do you have the one that the coffee? I'm going off memory here.
Colorblind Simulator. So
That's
the
fantastic.
website I showed you is called Coblis. So color-blindness.com. And then the plugin I have is called the No Coffee Vision Simulator.
I haven't seen the plugin before. I've with
plugin's handy. Yeah.
Yeah, the Color Blinder and the Color Brewer. I've seen those, and this is handy. I like this. Let's see here. Hey, John, do you have a favorite book series map?
A book series map? Oh gosh, I mean, I'd be a monster if it wasn't Lord of the Rings. And I've actually been inspired to build a style based on Lord of the Rings, not copying its textures directly to avoid copyright, but Nelson Styles. Find it at esriurl.com/Nelson Styles. I don't think I didn't share that in the big pile of links, but any style I make, I share publicly. So here's the Lord of the Rings.
I've seen that one. Yeah. So very nice. Someone asked a question. Any tips on color palettes and ramp selections for themes? You got any favorites?
See, I don't. Yes, actually, I do. It's called Viridis. Viridis color. So look up Viridis. They have a lot of packages that you can put into different GIS tool sets. ArcGIS Pro comes with some Viridis color palettes predefined. So the cool thing about Viridis is it's an alternative to the rainbow color scheme. Now, if you've got a rainbow color scheme, it's probably the wrong color scheme. It's easy to choose, and it ends up with a visually kind of pretty and attractive map. But you've got, as you can, let me zoom in on this. If you can see in this little image here, the cyan and the yellow start to pop a lot more than they should. And so you see these data banding effects, which are actually lying to you, right? You think this is more than this and vice versa. And really in a continuous data form, a rainbow color scheme is inappropriate and people will interpret it incorrectly. There's a lot of research people have done about that. And hands down, it's not the way to go. And so Viridis gives you nice alternatives to the rainbow color palette, and they're appropriate for colorblind viewers as well. They give you lots of examples.
There goes with R as well. I know they're using R census data. Yep. Well, I'm going to try to cram in a few more questions here, John, because it's blowing up. And anybody has a question, you can send it to our email address, and we'll get it to John. John, you have an invitation to. Do you want to come to Houston and talk to kids at high school students? Looks like an open invitation from Nicole. So if you are,
thanks, Nicole. Yeah, email me
down south, and we'll help set it up for you. Let's see here. Someone says, "Hey, from the Grand Valley." You got howdy from Lubbock. Again, what's the website with the fire data?
So I always find it by Googling it. I have to find it every time. So here's Google, and I say NASA fire data, active fire data. It's earthdata.nasa.gov, and then you can find the fire stuff.
Nice, nice.
If you just Google it, you should get there.
John, you have any favorite influential authors regarding papers on map design and colors? I mean,
yeah, somebody had mentioned Rob Simmons' series, Subtleties of Color. I'll click on that right now. They actually just shared it in the chat board. So give that a look. Rob's a fantastic mind when it comes to, well, a lot of things, but especially presenting data in a color scheme. So see what he's got to say there.
Maybe we'll have to talk to him about coming and join us for a presentation.
Sure.
But Okay, well, we've got about 2 minutes here. Anybody else? Oh, here's a good one. Someone wants to get a hold of that Appalachian Trail map that
Yeah,
you
yeah,
had.
sure.
They think it's fantastic.
So I just Googled John Nelson Appalachian Trail map, and there's lots of links here. They'll all take you to it. So here I am talking about how I made it and why. Here's a link to my blog where you can find that. And here's an Esri how-to if you're curious about making a map that looks like that. So
Okay.
lots of resources there.
Well,
As you can see, my internet tool is Googling stuff because I never remember or bookmark where anything is.
Nice. Well, you've got one last shout out from Brazil. They're living in Portland, Oregon, but they're saying hi from Brazil. So,
All right.
well, I tell you what. Again, this was a ton of fun, and we're just real happy that you said yes to us. It is a record in attendance for URISA Texas Speaker Series. I'm going to go with 202 until Addie totally corrects me.
Brian, I think I saw 600 on there at one point, just for a second.
That's what you got to tell your bosses. So it's nice, but no, we're pretty pleased here. And John, please, by all means, you're always welcome to come back. And if you come across something new and just need a platform, give us a shout out as well. But everybody, it's 1 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and shut her down. Everybody have a fantastic Thanksgiving, safe travels. And this is our last presentation for the year. We'll pick back up in January. Also have Merry Christmas and a good end to your year. So again, John, I hope you have a good rest of your day and stay warm, and hope you don't have too much snow to shovel. And if you make it down Texas way, please give us a shout.
I will. I certainly will. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Okay. All right. You all take care. Thank you. We'll put the recording up.
Cool. Goodbye.
Goodbye.